Ve'ela Toldot Yitzchak. This is the story of Isaac. What exactly is Isaac's story? The Pshat does not paint a clear picture. We barely hear Isaac's own voice. We first meet Isaac 2 portions ago at his birth and weaning, but these are not Isaac's stories. They're his mother's and his father's. This innocent child finds himself enveloped by household politics, where his mother exploits him as a tool for the expulsion of her rival. Soon afterward, we read about one of the most traumatic events in Isaac's life, the Akedah. But even as we label this story the binding of Isaac, the test is not his, it's his father's. Later, in his own matchmaking story, Isaac appears in only 6 of the 67 verses. Yet finally, in this week's Parashat, Toldot, Isaac receives his own story. Ve'ela Toldot Yitzchak. This is the story of Isaac. Unfortunately, here too, he once again suffers in the shadow of his formidable father. Ve'ela Toldot Yitzchak ben Avraham. Avraham holid et Yitzchak. This is the story of Isaac, son of Abraham. Abraham fathered Isaac. It is as if Isaac gains a story based only on his father's merit. And just as quickly as we begin Isaac's story, he gets 1 chapter, and then we move on to his sons, who take center stage bickering over birthrights and blessings. Thus, Isaac emerges as a passive figure. When the herdsmen of Gerar confront Isaac over the wells, he retreats. When Abraham drags him up the mountain, we barely hear his voice. Isaac acquires God's blessing, but only because of his father's worth. In the end, he fails to accomplish anything significant on his own. And yet, Isaac is our patriarch. He must have succeeded in some way. He must have his own story. Enter the rabbis. We learn from the midrash that Isaac performs not some minor role, a mere bridge between 2 greater individuals. Rather, Isaac is a man destined for greatness, a paragon of faith and courage. When Sarah gives birth to Isaac, the sun, moon, and stars rejoice. Blessings abound. Women struggling with barrenness conceive, and blind people regain their eyesight. Isaac's birth, the rabbis declare, is miraculous, and kings and sages even attend his weaning celebration. Then we get to the Akedah. Isaac and Ishmael squabble over who serves God more loyally, with Isaac declaring that he would willingly offer himself to God if only God so desired. During the binding itself, the rabbis provide Isaac with a voice. He does not use it to struggle or protest. Instead, Isaac instructs his father to tie him down tightly, lest he writhe and invalidate the sacrifice. In fact, Isaac remains so devout that even after the horrible events of the Akedah, he leaves to study in yeshiva. Indeed, Isaac is a pious patriarch. When he approaches Rebekah for the first time, he has just finished praying mincha, the first person to ever do so. As he advances, Rebekah witnesses a man with his hands outstretched toward the heavens in prayer, surrounded by the divine glow of the Shekhinah and accompanied by angels. In our parasha this week, the story of Isaac inspires purity. The rabbis emphasize that Isaac never leaves Eretz Yisrael because he had been bound as an offering, and thus had received the sanctity of an olah tamimah, a sacrifice without blemish. Thus, in the eyes of the rabbis, Isaac's story emerges as that of a human being whom God loved and blessed. Devotion to his father and to God, hard work, prayer, and study, these indicate Isaac's measure of worth. Therefore, as we explore the story of Isaac, we discover a character depicted in 2 extremes. On the one hand, shy, nebbishy, barely a blip on the biblical radar. And on the other hand, a model of piety, purity, and rabbinic greatness. Yet, Isaac is my favorite character because I hear a third voice when I read our portion, the voice of Isaac himself. If you listen closely, you too may hear Isaac sharing his story. Ve'ela Toldot Yitzchak. This is my story. Though it occurred decades ago, I can still picture my weaning. My father Abraham danced joyously, beaming with pride at me, his son. My mother Sarah smiled and glowed, though she also seemed distressed by something. And I had a big brother, Ishmael, my wild older brother, whom I adored with awe. Every day I anticipated the chance to play with him. We would often hike into the field and frolic with the flocks. Standing lovingly by my side, he patiently instructed me on how to carefully aim his bow and arrow. He showed me nothing but kindness. But one day, he left, unexpectedly, without warning. I remember cowering as my mom shouted at my dad. Next thing I knew, Ishmael was gone from my life. I did not encounter him again until decades later, when our dad passed away. Reuniting with Ishmael at the cave felt incredible. We embraced, holding on so strongly, two brothers locked in a loving hug that released years of yearning. My heart still aches with regret over the time we never shared. It was some time later when it happened. My father, usually so jubilant and lively, strode quietly and restrained as we climbed the mountain together. I did not understand what we were doing. A test, he kept repeating. The pit in my stomach tightened as I grew increasingly frightened. My father claimed that I was his beloved son. I trusted my father. I loved him. But our relationship never recovered after that moment on the mountain. Though he never touched me with the knife, he left invisible scars on my heart that never fully faded. I yearned achingly for real love. It was on the mountain that my eyes began to bother me. My mother, on the other hand, loved me very much. I knew that she protested our trip up the mountain, that she tried to stop my father. Unfortunately, it devastated her. When we did not immediately return from the mountain, she disappeared into the night, searching for us, believing me to be dead. We found out later that she died at Hebron. When we heard, I wailed in pain. Tears flowed uninterrupted. My vision slowly worsened. Love, it seemed, would never truly be mine. And so I felt lost. I longed for my mother, a burning hole still smoldering in my heart. I felt aimless, purposeless. My father's antics and schemes did not make sense to me. He could have the great name and the blessing, I thought, but all I yearned for was love of family. I suffered greatly. But then, it was a late afternoon and a haze descended on our camp. The sun sat low in the sky. I had been walking, simply going for a stroll. Yet that evening transformed my life. I noticed her from afar. As she slipped off her camel, I saw a woman of grace and beauty. And yet, I was also about to meet a woman prepared to leap into the unknown, willing to marry a stranger in a foreign land. Her courage and resilience always inspired me. I knew right away that she would push me, would be my strength and my rock. I was right. Time and time again, she shaped my life, made us the family we needed to be. I knew this immediately, from that very first moment we laid eyes on each other. And so I brought Rebecca into my mother's tent. I missed my mother, and yet I began to find peace. Rebecca and I loved each other like I had never loved anyone before or since. I recall my father articulating that word, love. But when he spoke it, the word rang hollow, a garment loose and unfitting. I spoke it and meant it with every fiber of my being. Ve'ehaveha, and I loved her. From that moment on, through our journeys together as partners, from the very depth of my soul, I loved her. This is what I craved, I realized. My father could have success in his covenants, his wars, his righteous arguing. Those did not fill me with purpose. This is what I wanted from life: to love and be loved, to start a family. I loved my wife like no other. Even when we could not conceive, I did not abandon her. How could I? She was my wife, my life partner. I did not seek a concubine like my father. I did not marry multiple wives like my son later would. I prayed for her. The only time I prayed to God, it was not for me, but for Rebecca. And thankfully, she finally conceived. I had my family. Esau, the hunter, Jacob, the trickster. I loved them both so much, though I'll admit I had a fondness for Esau, my wild son, who reminded me of my long-lost brother. And despite our children's arguments, I discovered that I finally felt happy, that I had accomplished something of my own. I had a family. I loved my wife. I still recall our trip to the Philistines, the land of the Philistines, where the king caught Rebecca and me being intimate in the garden. I felt so embarrassed. But that's the thing. Even decades after meeting her, I still found Rebecca to be just as exceedingly beautiful and inspiring as the day we first met. That's love. I would do anything to protect that love, my family. When the Philistines posed a threat, we left. Some may view this as cowardly, as avoiding confrontation, but I knew what I was doing. I was protecting the family that I worked so hard to create. Eventually, the boys matured, and we confronted a situation just as excruciating as the moment on the mountain. I found out later that Jacob had bought the birthright from Esau, and so in hindsight, I recognize that each child received what was due to him. Rebecca managed the scene from the background. Her strength emboldened me during this crisis. But I loved my sons. I loved Jacob, and I loved Esau. Yet when I blessed Jacob first, it devastated Esau. I devastated Esau. My blindness meant that I heard his pain even more acutely. He howled with grief. I trembled. I had caused this. I hurt my son when all I wanted was to love him. Fortunately, my life concluded with a happy ending. It took countless years, but Jacob and Esau eventually embraced each other again. Just like Ishmael and me, my sons rediscovered each other. When I breathed my last breath, together they buried me in the cave. Thus, looking back, I think I did all right. Our people may not recount as many epic tales about me as they do my father Abraham or my son Jacob. I may not have spoken with God enough, but I always put my family first. I loved my wife, and I recognized her inner and outer beauty every single day. I also helped nurture 2 beautiful boys who became parents to nations, and I continued my parents' legacy. Ve'ela Toldot Yitzchak. This is the story of Isaac. His story reveals success of a different nature. Through and through, Isaac is a family man, a man who loves and hurts deeply. Isaac's story informs my own. He speaks to me when I try to measure my own success, when I ponder what sort of son, partner, and future rabbi I aspire to be. Yet I still wonder, How do we navigate the tension between external satisfaction and internal purpose? In what ways do each of us measure success? When, for instance, must we strive for more in our careers? And when do we luxuriate in the beauty of our family lives? Or when do we put relationships above other priorities? Isaac's story leaves us with these questions. May we each have the ability to find our own voice and write our own story, one that demonstrates each of our own measures of success. Ve'ela Toldot Yitzchak. This is the story of Isaac.